Hi guys, welcome back. This week we're going to be talking about space tourism and what a few private companies have done in the past few years to make that dream closer and closer to reality. Before we get to that, I want to take a few moments to explain my recent 4-week hiatus. As you may have noticed, I haven't put up videos the past few weeks, and I wanted to take a moment to explain why. That first week was mainly just because of finals week. As you know, I am a college student, so I wanted to take as much time that week as possible to study, and I just didn't get around to making a video. Finals, they're stressful. You gotta do what you gotta do. The past 3 weeks, I've been home with my family in New Jersey, and I decided I wanted to spend as much time with family and friends as possible, and I didn't make any videos. But I'm back at school and we are back making videos. So hopefully in the future, if I decide to go on another hiatus like that, I will try to give you some warning beforehand. But that's where I've been the past 4 weeks. So back to this week's topic, space tourism. Space tourism has been around for a while, primarily in the form of a few very wealthy individuals who have bought rides on the Soyuz to the International Space Station. But, as I'm sure you can guess, that is not a form of space tourism that is available to people like you and me who are not billionaires. Instead, we are talking about the space tourism efforts by private companies such as Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic. Those two companies have been making huge strides in bringing access to space to a point where it is affordable for... Those two companies have been working for years to develop the technology to allow everyday people to buy a ride on these spacecraft into a suborbital trajectory, spending a few minutes in zero gravity, in space, being able to look out to the darkness of space and see the curvature of the Earth. Now, to understand how these companies do this and how their technology works, we are going to jump into my favorite space simulator, what some people might call a video game, Kerbal Space Program. Okay guys, here we are in Kerbal Space Program, although it may look a little different. As you might notice, we have replaced the normal planet Kerbin with our planet Earth, our nice home planet, which gives us a much better analog to show how companies like Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin have achieved the dream of space tourism. So here we are at my analog for Spaceport America, which is the launch site for Virgin Galactic. And for the purposes of this video, we will pretend that Blue Origin also launches from that location. But getting started with Virgin Galactic, let us look at their spacecraft. They have developed the spacecraft Spaceship 2, developed off of Spaceship 1, which won the Ansari X Prize. Spaceship 2 is a space plane, in that it launches like a rocket and lands like an aeroplane, in most ways. It actually launches carried underneath its carrier aircraft White Knight 2. Now, this model in Kerbal is not perfect, but for our purposes, it is a pretty good analog. It carries the Spaceship 2 spacecraft in the center, and the White Knight 2 aircraft is built around it. If we put it next to a picture, you'll see it is a pretty close analog, and also performs quite well in-game. To understand how the Spaceship 2 brings a group of passengers to space, we are going to fly a mock mission here in Kerbal Space Program. Every flight of Spaceship Two begins carried underneath the wing of White Knight 2, the carrier aircraft, which takes off like any normal aircraft. White Knight 2 is powered by a series of 4 engines, while Spaceship Two is powered by a single hybrid rocket motor. That rocket motor is inactive on the initial takeoff. So White Knight 2 is going to climb up to 14 kilometers. It's going to take it a while to get there, so we will come back when it is there. Okay, here we are cruising at our drop altitude of 14 kilometers, cruising at about 200 meters per second, which is significantly faster than the actual drop occurs at, but for the purposes of Kerbal, this is what we're gonna drop at. So, the way this is gonna go down is the spacecraft will separate and drop away from White Knight 2, and then quickly fire its rocket motor and pull up into the vertical and ascend towards space. So, let's do this. Coming up on drop. 3, 2, 1, release, release, release. And then fire the motor. Pulling quickly into the vertical. Down there we can see White Knight 2 is continuing on its flight. Because this is Kerbal, it will fly outside of our render range and will cease to exist. While in reality, White Knight 2 would return back to Spaceport America and land back on the runway. So here we can see we are accelerating rather quickly upwards, and we can see our apogee is passing 60 kilometers, 70 kilometers, 80 kilometers. That right there is the official definition of space according to the US. And now we are at 100 kilometers and cut off. Cut off at 112 kilometers apogee, which is well above the official designation of space, which is 100 kilometers, the Kármán line. 112 kilometers is a good approximation of what the vehicle is actually capable of. So far in testing, what Spaceship Two has only achieved about 82 kilometers, which is space according to US designation of 50 miles. That flight occurred just a few weeks ago, and was the first time they had put humans in space, as the spacecraft is flown by a pair of 2 pilots. They have not flown any passengers yet, but hopefully will in the near future. Now, the fun part of going to space is coming back home. This is all well and good when you're going straight up, but now that we're going to be coming straight back down, we got to find a way to slow down and land back at that runway. Luckily, the guys who developed Spaceship One had a brilliant idea, which has been transferred over to Spaceship Two, and that is a system known as the feather. And that allows the rear part of the spacecraft to do this. What this does is it adjusts the spacecraft's center of pressure. Normally, a spacecraft, well, any object flying through the air, wants to fly with its center of pressure directly behind its center of gravity relative to the airflow. That is what keeps a spacecraft or an aircraft flying straight. Normally, the center of gravity would be here, and the center of pressure would be back here, which would allow the spacecraft or aircraft to want to stay in a nose forward position. By moving these, the rear of the aircraft into this feathered position, it adjusts the center of pressure to in fact be above the center of gravity, meaning the spacecraft wants to descend in a belly first orientation, which exposes a much larger surface area to the airstream, which allows the spacecraft to slow much more rapidly instead of continuing on a ballistic descent, which would be a lot more dangerous. As we can see, the spacecraft is now passing through 100 kilometers, which is the defining line of space. We are now back, technically, no longer in space, and we are falling quite rapidly back towards the ground. We're going to accelerate time a little bit, and then see what aerodynamics do when we hit the air. As we can see, the spacecraft initially wants to nose down, but then as the air comes back, it pulls the nose back up and keeps it in a belly first orientation. This here is the thicker part of the air. The spacecraft is slowing down quite rapidly and has no need for a typical heat shield. Now that we are back within the heavier parts of the atmosphere, we can lower the feather and continue on a normal flight path, which includes pulling the nose up and gliding back to the runway. As you can see, the spacecraft is still traveling faster than the speed of sound, but we are quickly slowing due to our pull-up maneuver. So, like any normal aircraft, Spaceship Two returns back to a landing on a runway with normal landing gear and everything. Although technically the front nose gear on Spaceship Two is in fact a skid instead of a wheel. But Kerbal doesn't have skids, so we're just going to pretend that it lands with a normal front nose wheel. Comes back in for a nice smooth landing, back at the same runway from where it took off. Is a quick summary of how... So that is a quick demonstration of how Virgin Galactic plans to get passengers to and from space, and the brilliant design choices that went into that system. So next, we're going to look at Blue Origin and their New Shepard vehicle. While this one looks even less like New Shepard than my model of White Knight looked like White Knight, this will, in terms of function, very closely replicate how Blue Origin intends to bring passengers to and from space. It begins like any normal launch with the ignition of a rocket motor and a vertical ascent. However, unlike missions to the International Space Station or the Space Shuttle, this does not execute a gravity turn, it does not fly sideways, and it does not reach orbit. Instead, it simply ascends vertically, simply having the goal of passing the Kármán line. At the end of a lengthy burn, and having achieved an apogee of 100 kilometers, or slightly past the 100 kilometers, the engine cuts off and the vehicle enters a coast phase. Shortly after engine cutoff, the spacecraft, the capsule up top, which contains the passengers, will separate from the booster rocket. Due to my not so good build of the model, it enters a spin. It is not supposed to do that in real life. Instead, the capsule will fly very, very stably up past the Kármán line, allowing its passengers to experience a few minutes of weightlessness, look out into space, and overall enjoy the ride. At the end, the spacecraft lands under parachute, the simplest and safest way to land the crew. The booster, on the other hand, comes back home in a much more exciting way. The booster will be flown back using these fins down at the bottom, which for most of the ascent were just passive. And my favorite part of the design is this up here, a ring fin. Because, as I mentioned earlier, any object flying through air wants to fly with its center of gravity forward and its center of pressure behind. Now, in the case of a rocket, that is very challenging, as on launch you want your center of mass up top and your center of pressure down on bottom. But when you're trying to land, you want it the other way around, with your center of mass down at the bottom and your center of pressure up top. Now, draining fuel and separating the spacecraft will shift your center of mass, but still your center of pressure from launch is going to be down here. But what Blue Origin has done is they have added a fin up top, a ring fin, that at launch is blocked by the spacecraft, meaning it effectively contributes nothing to the center of pressure, allowing the center of pressure to remain near the bottom, keeping the vehicle stable on launch. But on descent, this ring fin is now completely exposed, and the air flowing through it creates a center of pressure that is further towards the top of the vehicle, creating a stable descent. Most of this descent features the rocket simply just falling out of the sky. As you can see, it is already traveling over 1 kilometer per second straight down, which is, as you would expect, quite terrifying for anything. But it has a series of air brakes to help slow part of the job. Those slow it when it's the denser atmosphere. It also has some aerodynamic steering capability to steer it away from its launch site and towards its planned landing pad. Last but certainly not least, it has that rocket motor it used to take off, which, for the fun of everyone watching down below, ignites at the last possible second. As we see here, the spacecraft is still falling, slightly slower than the speed of sound, but still very, very fast. At the very last second, the vehicle will light its BE-3 rocket motor and safely slow down to a insane but safe landing. And just like that, the booster, New Shepard, lands back on the surface of the Earth, while the spacecraft, with passengers aboard, safely descends under parachute. So that is how Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin plan to bring people to and from space in a very cheap and affordable and entertaining way. The engineering on both of these vehicles is brilliant, and both companies perfectly understood that the way to make space accessible to the everyday person is to lower the cost of access to space, and the best way to do that is to make your vehicles reusable. That is why Blue Origin figured out how to launch, land, and relaunch their New Shepard vehicle, and why Virgin Galactic has built essentially a space-worthy aircraft. With that, I want to thank you guys for watching. Quick reminder, I publish my videos every Thursday at 7 p.m., so keep an eye out for those. If you haven't already, please subscribe if you want to see more of my videos. If this is your first time watching any of my videos, I invite you to check out the rest of my channel, subscribe if you haven't already, and give this video a like if you liked what you saw. Once again, my videos go live every Thursday at 7 p.m., so I will see you then.